Okay, well, thank you and welcome to everyone for this Wednesday webinar, Planting for Monarchs. This is the first of probably a two-part presentation on monarchs because it'll take a full hour to an hour and a half to do everything from the start to finish on monarchs. So let's just talk about planting for monarchs. It's one of my favorite topics to discuss, as Macy just said. And it's amazing that there's a lot of people that really aren't aware of this beautiful butterfly and the rapid decline of its existence. And they depend on a host plant, milkweed, which is being basically wiped out by either harmful chemicals or just the loss of farmland across the country. I wasn't really aware of this until I attended a presentation about 7 years ago. And since then, I've been sharing this information and doing my best to help the monarch. And you too can help. My average year, I raise and release between 800 and 1,000 monarchs. I keep them no longer than a day, and then they're back out, going on to their next migration stop. So I love doing it and I love talking about it. So let's just go ahead and get started with this just a little bit. Let me tell you a little bit about the migration of the monarch. So the monarch butterfly starts all the way down in Central America, down below Mexico City. And this is where the monarchs migrate every fall, and they overwinter in mountainous pine trees down there. Then at the start of the new year, in the spring down there, they begin moving around and they mate. The monarchs then begin their migration north. So we're going to talk kind of about the east of the Rockies. That's where we're at. If you're outside of the east of the Rockies, kind of bear with me, but this is the migration over, as the map shows, kind of in the central to the eastern part of the country. So the monarchs will begin north. They'll lay eggs in Texas and maybe even Louisiana. And then that generation of monarch will slowly start to fade away. They've been 8 to 9 months their life. They live the longest of all the generations of monarchs. And you'll see sometimes if you start to look into this and see videos online, you'll see a real faded monarch with tattered wings. That monarch has been through quite a bit in its life. So the eggs will hatch and they'll continue up and develop, and they'll continue up north and east through mid-east states like Arkansas, Mississippi, lay eggs. Generation 2 will pick up the migration into Tennessee and lay their eggs. So we've got one full generation that has laid eggs, hung around, and then died. They'll live 2 to 6 weeks, these new monarchs. And then generation 2, they're going to go up into Tennessee, maybe the tipping into Kentucky. Generation 3 is what we see mostly in Kentucky and Southern Ohio, and it could be generation 4. It all depends on the weather. I always watch weather kind of frightfully during the migration time when you see big tornadoes or storms or even a hurricane down there in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm always like really afraid for the monarchs and people too, but the monarchs, because that'll slow them down. I usually spot the monarchs in June. I'll start getting calls. People will call me and say, I saw a monarch, and I know that they're coming. Each of these generations, as I said before, live 2 to 6 weeks. And you have to remember, these monarchs that we have never been here before. This is a new generation of monarchs that have never been here before, and I think that's really fascinating. So our monarchs, after the the eggs are laid here, a new generation will move on up to the Great Lakes. Okay, they'll go all the way up, sometimes into Canada. They'll even go that far. That will be the last generation for these American monarchs. And they're called the super generation. They're bigger. The caterpillars are bigger, the larva's bigger, the butterflies are bigger. And those monarchs will migrate all the way back to that site down in Central America. It could take 2 months for them to make the trip. It's, it could be 2,600 to 3,000 miles. These monarchs migrate back and overwinter in Mexico. So it's quite a fascinating story of the monarch. And we just need to help them along the way. The monarchs have never made that trip before, so you got to remember that. Now, on the way back down, you might see a monarch dipping down to sip some nectar off of pollinator plants, but they're not going to lay any more eggs. They're going to go all the way back to Mexico and just overwinter, and then they'll start again next year. So it's a pretty fascinating thing. So if you're interested in attracting monarchs, you need 2 things. You need pollinator plants. So the monarchs and other butterflies and other pollinators have water and energy, but it's key that you have both pollinator plants and milkweed. So why milkweed? So milkweed is the host plant for the monarch butterfly. That is where the monarch lays her eggs, and that is where the larvae eat. They will eat milkweed. They need milkweed. It's interesting. People say, well, how does the monarch know that that's milkweed to lay her egg on? And they have these sensors in their feet, and you'll see them when they land, they kind of move around, and that's how they tell that it's milkweed. Also, their proboscis, that long, skinny, kind of curly tongue that comes out on pollinators to grab the nectar down into the flower. The proboscis can also kind of sense that it's milkweed. So sometimes you can see them popping around from plant to plant before they lay their eggs. The female will sit on the milkweed and take her abdomen and kind of curl it under the leaf and pop an egg on the underside of the leaf. I think that helps to protect it from weather and other predators. So you really have to have milkweed. If you don't have any milkweed, it's kind of hard to dig it up, the common milkweed, which we'll talk about the different types, and move it. It doesn't transplant real well, but if you have trouble finding some milkweed, you might want to check with your extension office or call here at Mason County Extension Office. You also have to make a commitment when you're talking about pollinators, any kind, bees and butterflies. There's so many pollinators, not to spray chemicals or use chemicals on your garden, in or around your garden. Harmful chemicals will kill the pollinators. So you have to kind of make that commitment. Also, you need to have a sunny location. You need to have windbreaks, because some of these pollinators, including milkweed, they get really tall, and a good wind will just blow them over. So windbreaks are kind of nice, just a fence, a shrub, or a wall. You want to test your soil. If you're starting from scratch, or even if you have a garden existing, you can grab some soil out of your garden, and the extension office will help you get that tested. That's pretty important too. If you're starting from scratch, you need to remove any other plant cover or grass from the soil and get it ready to plant. If your space is limited, or you don't want milkweed spreading everywhere, which milkweed will do that, I promise you, consider planting in pots or containers. I do that a lot with milkweed because then I can pick that big pot or that planter up, and I can get it into the garage or the barn and let it overwinter, and it'll come right back. It is a perennial. So you might want to consider that. You might want to say, let me just see if this is going to work in my garden. Let me just put some milkweed in a pot. Milkweed, like we talked about before, it is a necessity for monarchs. There's different varieties, and we'll go to a next slide to show you the different varieties of milkweed. If you can, do a little research, use native plants whenever possible. Those are going to survive the best in our grow zone. So do a little research on that. The plants always need to be watered. We all know that. So don't let it get all dried out, or you won't have the source of nectar for your pollinators. Like I said before, don't use herbicides or insecticides to get rid of unwanted plants or insects. Just weed by hand. People always ask me, well, what about other caterpillars or other beetles or whatever? Well, you know what? I take a big jar of soapy water and I just flick off a Japanese beetle or other beetles, other unwanted pests. If you use herbicides or insecticides, you're also going to kill good bugs like ladybugs, praying mantis, assassin bugs, lacewing. Those are great, good bugs that help eat the bad bugs. So just try to make a commitment to that. And once you start doing it, it's really not hard. If you have bird baths or other water containers in your garden, they need to be shallow, or put rocks, pebbles, or marbles in them. Bees will drown. Their little wings, when they get wet, they can't fly. And butterflies are the same way. So they like to have water, yes, absolutely, but make sure they have something that they can kind of perch on. Some of the common pollinator plants on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see, and you're going to recognize so many of them, and you're going to be like, I didn't know that was a pollinator plant, or maybe you do know. The very opening sign was the Mexican sunflower. I call it, a common name is torch, and it's one of my favorite to plant, and it's one of my favorite to take pictures of butterflies. So all these over on the right can help with all kinds of pollinators, not just the monarch. The shrubs and grasses kind of give them the opportunity. We'll get into this in just a minute. When they hatch from the egg and go from their different stages of the larva, it's a place for them to kind of go to and shed their skin and relax, and then they come back even bigger and stronger back to their milkweed. Here's 3 common milkweed in this area. So the picture in the top left is common milkweed. It's a really pretty big globy purple flower, and it grows quite tall, and it has big leaves on it. You'll see it in farmlands and ditches by the side of the road, or maybe in your yard. It does grow like crazy, and it's one of the monarch's favorites, milkweeds in this area. The one on the right is called, the common name is swamp milkweed. It's my absolute favorite. I live on a creek. I have 2,000 feet of water frontage on quite a big creek, like a small river, and it's native and it's in abundance. It's also a branchy type of milkweed, so it grows more like a shrub than a straight stalk going straight up. Like the common milkweed's a straight stalk going up with big leaves. This one's smaller, thinner leaves. I like it because when I'm raising monarchs in the summer, I need to have lots of milkweed for the caterpillars to eat, and I can put that in a big jug of water, and it'll last 3 or 4 days, big branches of it. So it's one of my favorite, and it grows really well in containers. The bottom one on the left is common name for that is butterfly weed. It's really pretty. It's showy. It's smaller than the other two milkweeds. The only thing I caution people is that it will keep blooming as long as the weather's good. So I caution people to go ahead and get that trim back when we hit September, because the monarchs really need to start migrating. And if they have a good source of milkweed, they'll stick around. The other two milkweeds will stop. They'll do it on their own. They'll stop and drop the flowers and they'll stop blooming and so forth. So if you use the butterfly weed, there's nothing wrong with that. Just make sure that you don't keep it around for a real long time in the fall. I've tried to transplant the big common milkweed, the ones with the big the stalk, the one in the top left-hand corner, and it's really hard to transplant it. But the other two are easy to find and easy to grow. So these are the stages of the monarch larva, and I call them cats. I don't mean meow cats. I just call them cats. So if you hear me call them cats from here on out, that's what I'm talking about. I like to show this because a lot of people, and I put this on my Facebook page, usually this time of the year, don't squish the caterpillar. They don't realize what a monarch caterpillar looks like. They start very, very small. You can see the number one, it's really small. And then two, I think there's a one on this screen. Then two, they get a little bit bigger, so they'll shed their skin and they go through instars, so 5 instars. And from the time that the egg hatches, which is 3 days from the time the monarch lays the egg, 3 days the egg will hatch, and then about 2 weeks to go through this whole stage. And the 5th instar, it's quite big. Like if you would hold up your index finger, it'll be that big. They're beautiful caterpillars, I think, and I like to share this because I don't want people to think that they have a pest in the garden. That's a monarch butterfly, or will be a monarch butterfly. So this is kind of a drawing that I do whenever I start a new garden. This is our one of our monarch way stations here in Mason County, and this is what we started with. And I kind of have fun when I draw. I do companion planting and make sure that I have plenty of beautiful blooms for the nectar and the water. In the middle, it's all herbs. It's an herb garden because herbs will flower too, and the monarchs really love that. All pollinators do love that. I just think it's kind of fun to draw this up. So get your colored pencils out and draw you up a good garden. So this is Joe Pieweed. It's one of the plants that are listed in the previous slide. And this is in one of my gardens on our farm, and it's registered as a monarch way station. You don't have to have a monarch way station, but there's a lot of benefits to going to monarchwatch.org. They'll ask you some questions. I think 100 square feet is the size that they like to see, but it doesn't have to be in one garden. So if you have like a little space by your garage and another space out in the further out in the yard, as long as it's kind of a total of that amount, then they're fine with that. And then you have to list the pollinators that you have planted, and then your GPS location, and they will send you a sign. I think you have to pay for the sign if you want a sign. But I have probably 5 different pollinator habitats now on our little farm, and I just have one registered. By registering it, I can also sign up for little tags. They're so tiny, you won't even believe it, but they stick on the bottom side of the monarch's wing, and it tracks the monarch. And I've had about a couple dozen monarchs that have been reported back to me that have made it all the way to Mexico. So probably more than that have made it, but it's other people that see it and they've got a little code that can be scanned. It's just crazy. So Monarch Watch has a lot of resources. You can buy milkweed there. You can talk, if you're with an extension office, you could ask your agent to contact them. And if I'm not mistaken, it's no cost for the extension office, and they get sent 32 plugs, and it's a way for others to get that milkweed and get it started. Once you plant one, you are really good to go. It will continue to spread in your habitat and give you a lot of joy with monarchs.